I was introduced to Krishna consciousness in May of 1969. I was in the U.S. Navy at the time, in the process of getting out, and my friends reminded me that that Jimi Hendrix was giving a couple of concerts at a venue here in Honolulu called the Waikiki Shell over the weekend, and they asked me if I wanted to go. Um, I this was actually the first rock concert I ever attended. I'd been to lots of folk concerts and musicals and stuff, but while I was in the Navy, stationed in the Navy here, because I was an intelligence analyst, I tried to be careful about where I was seen in public. Because I had a very restricted top secret clearance, and my off-duty activities weren't always compatible with such a clearance. It was the 60s. I was stationed in Hawaii. You can do the math if you like. Um, but since those activities had already come to light, when my friends asked me if I wanted to go to this concert, I just shrugged and said, I don't know. Is the Pope Catholic? Um, and anyway, I met the devotees there. I had heard the Maha Mantra before. Um, I had tried reading Bhagavad Gita. I was really into Gandhi when I was young, especially when I was in the Navy. My experience in the Navy kind of had me trending pacifist. And so I was really impressed by Gandhi's nonviolent resistance idea. But when I chanted the Maha Mantra with the devotees, that was just a completely different experience. When I heard them chanting and I chanted with them, um, that pretty much changed my life. So I got out of the Navy a few months later, came back to Hawaii, and a few months after that, I ended up moving into the temple and I took up Krishna consciousness full time. I was a brahmachari for 3 years. I was married for a little over 40 years. Had two daughters and four grandchildren. And I accepted sannyas about a little over 12 and a half years ago, Janmashtami of 2012. And I've been back in Hawaii full time for the last 5.5 years. Um, and I supported my family in a number of ways. I also actually, though, I started a Gurukula here in Hawaii in the late 70s and worked at another one um, in California for a few years before I finished graduate school and started teaching in college.
And a Gurukula being, a place of
Oh,
boarding school, so to speak. Yeah.
yeah, Gurukula. We had a little Gurukulas are famous or infamous, I guess, depending on your perspective, in ISKCON. Um, and there were generally they were boarding schools. We had a boarding facility here at the temple for boys in Hawaii. We had an ashram for girls for a little while, and some personal things happened that made that hard to maintain. Um, the devotee who was running it um, just had to make some changes in her life, and so it wasn't sustainable. Um, when when I first met the devotees, after having joined the Navy, I had determined at that point that I was never going to join anything ever again in my life. It was a very disappointing experience. So even though I was really drawn to the Sankirtan, when I would go to Waikiki to chant with the devotees, I would usually stand on the other side of the street because I didn't want to get close enough to any devotees that ended up I would end up joining anything again. However, one night It was a Saturday night. I was standing on the other side of the street chanting, and when I turned around to go back to my house, there was a devotee standing at my elbow waiting for me. And he invited me to the feast the next day, which I agreed to do. And that was really kind of the end, complete end of my material life. Um, and when I did go to that feast, he showed me, he asked me if I'd ever read Bhagavad Gita. And I told him that I'd tried reading 3 or 4 different editions of Bhagavad Gita, but I couldn't penetrate it. I couldn't figure it out. Didn't. And I think for me, a big part of it was getting through the first chapter with all those names. And they didn't mean anything to me because I wasn't brought up with Mahabharata as part of my culture. So it was just all a bunch of foreign names. And then when we finally got through those, Krishna was telling Arjuna that he had to fight against his relatives and friends. And by the time I was in the Navy and really trending pacifist, it didn't make any sense to me. So that kind of made it hard for me as well. But this devotee, his name is Turiyadas, showed me Bhagavad Gita as it is. Back then, it was just the little abridged Macmillan Gita. And he asked me if I'd ever seen that edition. I hadn't. And I thumbed through it, read a page or two here or there at random. And I remember looking up at Turiyadas and saying, I don't understand how this is so, but for some reason, this makes more sense to me than anything I've ever read. And he just smiled. It's like, okay, you're one of us, buddy. Um, I got a copy of Bhagavad Gita, started going to classes at the temple. And so we had classes, Bhagavad Gita classes at the temple. I think it was Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and we went, and the devotees went out on Sankirtan Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. So after a couple of weeks, I was going to the temple on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays for Bhagavad Gita class and going down to Waikiki for Sankirtan in the evening, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. And after a couple of months of that, it was just real clear to me that I needed to try needed to try living in the temple. I had no sense of myself as a disciple or prospective disciple. Um, that happened when I started reading Srimad Bhagavatam. The Srila Prabhupada's purport to the second verse of Srimad Bhagavatam really just finished everything for me. That convinced me that I needed to become a disciple, that I needed to actually spend my time and energy working for the Sankirtan movement to help effect what I saw as the revolution that we were all actually looking for back in the 60s. And what convinced me of that was a sentence in the purport to the second verse where Srila Prabhupada wrote. He was talking about how, he's writing about how everyone in the material world is competing for different kinds of resources. And he said, but the transcendental devotees of the Lord don't compete with others for material resources, but instead they strive to create a competition-less society with God at the center. And when I read that sentence, I just knew this was it. This was the revolution that we'd been looking for. And I was ready to sign up by that point. Met Srila Prabhupada later that year. He came in the summer just for a day. And I've been his ever since. I have to admit that generally, chapter 16 is not a chapter I spend a lot of time with. However, the impressions we get from reading chapter 16 are pretty strong and sometimes maybe a little familiar, perhaps even uncomfortably so. Oh, wait, I'm seeing the, oh, yes, I'm in Honolulu right now, so it's mid-afternoon for me. Um, so,
And can we come join you there? Would be nice.
we, we don't have a lot of room, but we'll figure it out. We do have plenty of service, though. That'll be easier to figure out. Um, but yeah, everyone should come visit. Everyone should come see the original Panchatattva deities. When I was in Mayapur this last winter, late in the winter, um, I think it was for Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's appearance day. We were all in the Panchatattva's temple, and I was standing next to my old friend Shrutakirti, who spent a lot of time living here. And he looked at me and he says, Maharaj, you're a long way from home. And I motioned to the deities and I said, no, I'm right at home because my worshipable Lord's replicas are right here. So he thought that was a good joke. Um, this is this is a chapter that's probably a little familiar to us in different ways. So I just thought I'd read just the first couple of verses, the first few verses, maybe the first 5 verses, just to so that to kind of like orient myself, I guess. Um, so and this is something you're all very familiar with, having discussed it over the last several weeks, probably. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, fearlessness, purification of one's existence, cultivation of spiritual knowledge, charity, self-control, performance of sacrifice, study of the Vedas, austerity, simplicity, non-violence, truthfulness, freedom from anger, renunciation, tranquility, aversion to fault-finding, compassion for all living entities, freedom from covetousness, gentleness, modesty, steady determination, vigor, forgiveness, fortitude, cleanliness, and freedom from envy and from the passion for honor. These qualities, O son of Bharat, belong to godly persons, godly men endowed with divine nature. And then we have a shift. Pride, arrogance, conceit, anger, harshness, and ignorance. These belong to those of the demoniac nature. The transcendental qualities are conducive to liberation, whereas the demoniac qualities make for bondage. Do not worry, O son of Pandu, for you are born with the divine qualities. Now, as we go through the chapter, we see verse after verse explaining the psychology and the behavior of those whose nature is other than godly. And these are people who are pretty familiar to us. If we have the ill fortune to follow the news at all, we see this in spades, especially at election time. Um, we just had a couple years election season here in the U.S. And now we're enjoying the results of that election. And what we see, regardless of party, what we see in both the main parties are people whose character is largely defined in the bulk of this chapter. Um, so we can continue a little bit. In text 7, Krishna says, those who are demoniac do not know what is to be done and what is not to be done. Neither cleanliness nor proper behavior nor truth is found in them. They say that this world is unreal, with no foundation, no God in control. They say that it's produced of sex desire and has no cause other than lust. Following such conclusions, the demoniac who are lost to themselves and have no intelligence engage in unbeneficial, horrible works meant to destroy the world. And this is something that I think is particularly this last phrase, unbeneficial, horrible works meant to destroy the world. I think this is something that became particularly clear in the last 80 years. I'm moving in on 80. Uh, and and it's really since shortly before I was born, for about the last 80 years, that we've seen um, very clearly um, unbeneficial, horrible works meant to destroy the world. Um, we've, we've had for the last 80 years now, we've had a world um, bothered by nuclear and thermonuclear weapons and other things as well. Lots of attempts at um, chemical warfare, and well, that's been for more than 100 years, and biological warfare as well. And this is just, I mean, I don't think anyone here would question that that just sounds nuts. Um, I grew up, I'm an older baby boomer, as they call us, and I grew up in the shadow, actually, of of atomic bombs. My dad, before I was born, my dad was a Navy photographer for the first two A-bomb tests after World War II at Bikini Atoll in the summer of 1946. And I find it interesting. I don't know if anyone else does, but of the children conceived by the people who were present for those two A-bomb tests in 1946, of the children conceived by them once they got back home, I'm the first one who was born. That was because I was premature. Um, so, I mean, I grew up with my whole life literally with, well, kind of figuratively, I guess, but almost literally with the bomb in our front room, because my dad had these books that were a photographic record of those tests, including some of his own photographs. And we grew up under the threat of nuclear war, as children and as teenagers. When I was a sophomore or junior in high school, 1963, 62. The Cuban Missile Crisis, I think, was October of 1962. So I would have been in the 10th grade then. And so we were very, very close to all-out nuclear war for some period of time in the fall of 1962. And we still have this kind of hanging over our heads nowadays. Um, there's always uh, something that could be taken as an excuse for at least tactical nuclear war. Now people are concerned about what might happen because of the Russians' over 3 years old invasion of Ukraine, and then there's always tension in the Middle East, always tension between Israel and other countries. So when if we were to talk about horrible, unbeneficial works meant to destroy the world, um, if we go back more than 80 years, we might not have had a very clear idea what that means. It might have sounded a little hyperbolic, but it doesn't. It really just doesn't anymore. between the threat of nuclear war, chemical warfare, but even worse, biological warfare, which is something people worry about every time there's a bad flu season. What to speak of an actual pandemic of a lethal virus like COVID-19 or the avian flus, and all the all the different viruses that are circulating around the world nowadays. So that people could seriously think that there's any benefit from creating such weapons. It's very much I think a product of a very skewed perspective, a very strange outlook on life. We see at the beginning of the Bhagavatam, in that second verse of the Bhagavatam, the first line tells us in a sense who the audience most likely to appreciate the Bhagavatam's message is. And that is people who are completely, or who've already rejected what the Bhagavatam calls cheating dharma, kaitava dharma. And, so we might wonder, what do we mean by, why kaitava dharma? And in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami answers that question. He said, what do we mean by when we say why does it call it kaitava dharma? What are we talking about? We're talking about dharma, artha, kama, moksha, vancha, the great goals of human life. In Sanskrit, these are called the purusharthas, the great values, the great goals of human life. Dharma, at least conventional dharma, the kind of dharma that Krishna tells Arjuna to completely reject at the beginning, at the end of the Bhagavad Gita. So our personal virtue, and then what comes from that would be artha, making material progress, getting ahead in the world. And that naturally yields kama, or pleasure. And then when we've seen through that whole scam, I guess, we want to become free from these things. So we want moksha, we want liberation. And so these are referred to at the beginning of the Bhagavatam as cheating religion, because they're self-centered. Their focus is me, my virtue, my material progress, my pleasure, my freedom. But the Bhagavatam suggests a panchama purushartha, a fifth great value for human society, which is love. Prema prayojana, prema pumartho mahan. This is the greatest of all the goals that anyone can strive for. So those who are born of the divine nature, or who have cultivated the divine nature by association, they are on what in Sanskrit is called apavarga. They're on the path to liberation. They're on the path that frees them from things like just working ourselves into the grave, and always being afraid. This is called pavarga in Sanskrit. And Srila Prabhupada has described those 5 different consonants, pa, pa, ba, pa, ma, working hard, foaming at the mouth. Gosh, I can't remember one. I'm bad with lists sometimes. Fear, and then ultimately death, mrityu. So, but the path of liberation is called apavarga, which is the opposite of this bondage. So we see that those who have acquired this these godly qualities. And we have quite a list here um, at the beginning of this chapter by contrasting with what's discussed in the rest of the chapter. Um, that those folks are on the path of liberation, on the apavarga. So, and those who are caught up in this cycle of less than godly qualities, always sworn to unclean work and attracted by the impermanent. Attracted by the impermanent, all of a sudden, that phrase spoke to me in a way that it probably hadn't for a long time. When I met the devotees, well, when I moved into the temple, by the time I moved into the temple, especially after I got out of the Navy, my main activity was surfing. So talk about being attracted by the impermanent. Um, a big part of my time and energy were spent chasing pulses of energy as they coursed toward the shore of the ocean and disappeared, and trying to milk a little bit of pleasure out of those things while they lasted. Um, there's there are probably fewer things, I think, more ephemeral than ocean waves. Now, fortunately, there are a lot of them. They're constant. But talk about being attracted by the impermanent. And then we see there's this really striking verses 13, 14, and 15. This is the hubris of the materialistic person. So much wealth do I have today, and I will gain more according to my schemes. So much is mine now, and it will increase in the future more and more. He is my enemy, and I've killed him, and my other enemies will also be killed. I am the Lord of everything. I am the enjoyer. I am perfect, powerful, and happy. I am the richest man surrounded by aristocratic relatives. There's none so powerful and happy as I am. Oh, I'll perform some sacrifices. I'll give some charity. And in this way, I'll rejoice. And then Krishna goes on to describe such persons as bound by a network of illusion, self-complacent, deluded by wealth and false prestige, bewildered by false ego, by pride, by lust, by anger, and envious of everyone else. And in text 20, he says that when we get caught in this in such a cycle, it's virtually impossible to escape. He says, those who are envious and mischievous, the lowest among men, I perpetually cast into the ocean of material existence, into various demoniac species of life. Such persons can never approach me. Gradually, they sink down to the most abominable type of existence. I remember hearing years ago from actually two devotees who at the time were members of the GBC that Srila Prabhupada had told them that when one engages in meat eating, especially in cow slaughter, in any way, that they have to take birth as a cow and be slaughtered as many times as there are hairs on the cows that they've eaten. And Srila Prabhupada's conclusion to that was that the only escape is divine grace. This is how entangling it is, especially to become involved in cow slaughter. So Krishna says to Arjuna that such people can't ever approach him. So as we approach the end of the chapter, we see people like this described simply as faithless. Their perspective is whatever they can perceive based on their sense, based on their sense perception, whatever they're able to see, hear, smell, taste, um, and um, and whatever they're able to wrap their minds around. And if something doesn't fit that model, that paradigm, doesn't fit, and when we look at it, when we look at ourselves carefully, we can kind of see that there's a real sense in which we do behave as if we were the center of the universe. All these phrases used to describe the demoniac nature, uh, not so unfamiliar to us. And so what's required is a change of perspective, a change of vision. Instead of looking at the world through materialistic um, lenses, um, but if we look at it through the lens of the instructions of the Shastra and the instructions of the sadhus, the saintly persons, then we can have a completely, we can have an absolute shift in perspective and actually develop faith in the instructions um, of saintly persons and in the instructions of the scriptures. And when we talk about faith, we're not just talking about belief. Belief is something that's malleable, tender, changes a lot. Um, who was it? Winston Churchill um, said about political perspectives. He said, if someone's not a liberal when they're 20, they have no heart. And if they're not a conservative, by the time they're 40, they have no brain. Something like that. So these, our beliefs are malleable. They're easy to change. They're very komal, very tender. And sometimes we see people, um, their whole perspective on life is based on the last thing they heard from somebody, even among some of our political leaders. When I was a boy, when I was little, we went to a Methodist church because that was a church our family kind of belonged to. I lived in a, when I was, until I was 9, we lived in a very small town on the central coast of California. And my family was a rather prominent family. My great grandfather was one of the town's founders. So we went to church. Now, my father was an agnostic. And as soon as we moved away from that small town, my father stopped going to church because he didn't believe. Um, he would rather go scuba diving on Sundays anyway. Um, my mom didn't go to church because she was just busy with 3 crazy kids. And my brother and sister were too little to go to church. And so I ended up going to church by myself. Starting at the age of 9, I was the only person in my immediate family who went to church regularly. Um, so I went to a Methodist church for a while, and then for a few years, I went to a Presbyterian church. Um, that was when we lived in the Los Angeles area because the friends that I made in my new school went to that church. Then later I went to a Methodist church until, again, until I discovered an Episcopal church that whose minister had a very ecumenical, very broad-minded perspective. And that appealed to me much more than any of the churches that I had gone to before. So my faith, my faith in the sense of belief, how I believed in God was changing. And then there was a time when I just really wasn't sure how I believed in God. I never actually gave up belief in God. And then I became a Hare Krishna. But when we talk about faith, the Sanskrit word is Shraddha. And Lord Chaitanya defines Shraddha in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita in his talks with Sanatana Goswami. He says, Shraddha Shabde Vishwas Kohi Sudrita Nishchoy. Krishna Bhakti Koile Sarva Karma Krita Hoy. When we talk about Shraddha, what we're talking about is Sudrita Vishvasa. Vishvasa means conviction. It doesn't mean just belief. It means conviction. And Sudrita, Dridha means firm, and Sudrita, Su in this instance serves as an intensifier. So it means very firm conviction in what? That if I just engage in Krishna Bhakti, everything else is going to be taken care of. All my other needs will be satisfied. And so when we talk about conviction, that doesn't come from just having heard from somebody. It comes from experience. So when we have some experience of engaging in bhakti and seeing how that affects our lives and others' lives as well, then that very strong conviction comes. So then we'll have a shift into the 7th chapter of discussing, where we discuss different kinds of faith. And we see in that chapter that Krishna says that a person is actually defined by their faith, by their shraddha. So we define a Vaishnava by their faith in Vishnu, right? And we define materialists by their faith in matter. I remember many, many years ago when I took a philosophy course. This was after having been practicing for a while. And I went back to college because I had a family and I realized I've got to figure out some way to take care of my family. So I had to go back and finish college. And I took a philosophy course one semester. This is when I was living on the island of Maui. And my philosophy professor was actually a cool guy. He actually lived right across the road from the devotee farm that I lived on. And he and his neighbor would sit out on their front porch on Sunday evenings and listen to the kirtan. And he had a number of Srila Prabhupada's books in his office at the college and more at home. I think he had a full set of Bhagavatams as well as the Bhagavad Gita. And his final exam was just one question, one prompt actually. It was define and defend the philosophy of materialism. Well, what we'd learned is that the philosophy of materialism is based on the fact that on the assumption that there's nothing but matter. Just as we see that everything in this world is a result of sex. It's all driven by sex desire. So I wrote several pages. We had 2 hours for 3 hours, I think, for final exams. And so I wrote several pages explaining and defending the philosophy of materialism. And I still had time left, so I took it apart. And he loved that. It was a really, really long essay written out by hand. And he sent it back to me. And he said, if we gave A pluses, this would be an A plus. He says, this is the war and peace of my philosophy 101 final exams. Because I defended materialism and then I destroyed it by arguing simply from Srila Prabhupada's books. So, what we see, chapter 16 is by the time we get to the end of chapter 16, we get to this transition where we move into a discussion of what faith really means. Faith influenced by the different modes of material nature, as well as transcendental faith. So that's a big adventure yet to come. Now, I've been talking for far too long, over half an hour, and we only have a little while left. So what I wanted to do is see if any of you would be willing to share with us, including me. You probably had plenty of discussions going through this chapter. If there's anything about this chapter that any of you find particularly striking or inspiring, or revelatory, uh, I would love to listen to such discussion. Mm, feel free to unmute yourselves. I think you can unmute yourselves, right?
Yeah, couple, go ahead.
Hare Krishna Maharaj, Dandavat Pranam. Please accept my good obeisances. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.
Jai Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Maharaj, I'm so fortunate to actually, see you and, getting to talk to you. Yeah, I'm like, very grateful to Yamuna Jivan Prabhu for arranging this. He definitely, he mentioned about meeting you in Hawaii when he was visiting.
Oh,
Yeah, he definitely talked about it, but yeah, I didn't never thought that, I'll be able to see you and meet you. Maharaj, you were talking about this statement. Um, this was the statement, right? Such transcendentalists are non-envious and pure in heart. In the material world, everyone is envious of everyone else, and therefore there is competition. But the transcendental devotees of the Lord are not only free from material envy, but are well-wishers to everyone. And they strive to establish a competition-less society with God in the center. Just this evening, Maharaj, I was reading this with my devotee friends. We have a Bhagavatam reading group.
oh,
We were reading this statement. We came across this purport, and I was so touched when you again talked about it. And yeah, I have never read first canto before. It's my first time reading it, so I'm looking forward to it and with like all your blessings, Maharaj.
oh, there's an adventure. First canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. Prabhupada mentioned on some occasions that he endeavored to put everything that we would need into the first canto in case um, in case he wasn't able to um, um, in case he wasn't able to write anything else. Fortunately, he was able to write um, quite quite a bit more, and he got us um, a little bit into into the 10th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. And fortunately, among the things that he had written previously was the Krishna book, so that we had the whole 10th canto of the Krishna book sort of tied up, wrapped up like a present and tied up with a bow in the form of the 2 volumes of Krishna book. And so um, I I, I remember moments from my first reading of the first canto of the Bhagavatam. So you've got a real adventure ahead of you. There's some just such wonderful discussion, even in that even in that first canto. Um, Narada Muni tells his story. Uh, after he tells Vyasadeva his story after coming to straighten him out. Vyasadeva sitting there, you'll see in the 4th and 5th chapter, bewildered about why he doesn't feel satisfied after compiling the 4 Vedas, all the Puranas and the Itihasas such as the Mahabharata and Ramayana, and still he felt unfulfilled, and he was just trying to figure out why. So Narada Muni came along and straightened him out, actually. So yeah, thank you for that, and a little synchronicity with that purport from the second verse. Thank you
Yes,
so
Maharaj.
much for sharing that, Kapil.
Thank you, Maharaj. Maharaj, I had a follow-up just really briefly. Here in the first verse of 16th chapter, Krishna talks about aversion to fault finding.
Mm.
Maharaj, according to you, how is it that we, living entities who are here in the material world, we all have this tendency of fault finding? How do we overcome it? I would like to hear your views. Yamunashan Prabhu has already put some light on it previously, but just
How do
want,
we overcome it?
yes, and envy as well if possible.
Pardon?
And envy as well. How do we like be non-envious, as Prabhupada stated
Oh.
in the purport as well?
I think the two go hand in hand, envy and the tendency to find faults. Because we do, I mentioned that we seem to have a tendency to act as if we were the center of the universe. And we do in a sense, because we see things as important depending on how much they touch our lives, how close they are to us. So my family is very important. You know, I'm of course surrounded by aristocratic people. I remember, you know, and I think we naturally, especially if we grow up in families that aren't completely, um, well, abusive anyway. I was going to say completely dysfunctional, but I think most of our families are dysfunctional to one degree or another. Especially by the time the boys get to be 10 years old and the girls get to be 13 or 14. Um, uh, Sometimes families can kind of seem to spin out of control. But my own family having been an exception, somehow or other, my daughters grew up, and I give all credit to my former wife. Um, that our daughters grew up without most of the, you know, worst teenage things that kids had to deal with. They were never attracted by drugs or boys or anything when they were in high school. They both started dating late and ended up marrying the first guy that they felt was good enough to go out with. Um, and they both have teenage kids now, so the marriages have lasted quite a while. And but generally we see, you know, my family, my political party, my high school football team or college football team, or my town's football team. Um, I was on Facebook a little earlier and I saw some devotee from, well, a devotee I know, he lives in Australia, but I think he's from UK. And he posted something about some name that was unfamiliar to me. So I looked it up and it turns out it was, I guess it's a UK football team, what we call soccer here in the US. And so, you know, we tend to think, you know, so you've got people who are, you know, you've got the Philadelphia 76ers fans can't stand the Pittsburgh Steelers fans or something like that, right? In high school, usually the closest high school was the biggest rival for football and basketball. And those are kids that we probably went to elementary school or junior high school with. And all of a sudden we're getting into fights at the football game, you know, it's just, so this is our sense that things are important to the extent that they touch me. And if they don't touch me at all, it doesn't matter. It just really doesn't matter. Um, so, you know, to the extent that we have a sense of selfishness, we're going to envy people who have things that we want and can't have or don't have yet. And sometimes that causes us not only to find fault, but to highlight whatever faults we see in those folks, to broadcast them. And we see our politicians doing that all the time nowadays. It's a constant barrage. And it's, you know, now that we're immersed in social media, it's even worse than it ever was. And it's certainly not new. It's as old as human society, I guess. Um, how do we become free from envy and from the tendency to criticize others? Um, that is brought about largely by the process of cleansing the mirror of the heart, Cheto Darpana Marjanam, as Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu prays in the beginning of his Shikshastakam. getting a clearer vision of who we all really are, not just who I am, but that each of us is, each of us has an eternal, intimate relationship with our source, with the Supreme, with Krishna, with God, depending on, how we want to see that. And if we develop that vision, that's the vision of the Bhagavatam. That's the vision that we see introduced here and there in the Gita. If we read those first two paragraphs of Srila Prabhupada's preface to his presentation of Srimad Bhagavatam, what we see there is a very broad vision of human society as all being related. Prabhupada refers to this as spiritual communism. And this is the vision that the Bhagavatam gives us. It's this, and that's why I saw it, I think, as the Bhagavatam's perspective is so utterly revolutionary, absolutely revolutionary. A society which we see later in the first canto based on simplicity, cleanliness, truthfulness, and mercy. And when I read that, where this is when King Parikshit confronts the personality of the age of Kali, this age of hypocrisy and quarrel that we live in now. And we see that, cruelty to animals and all the things that are really the basis of our society nowadays, that these things really drag us on this path, I guess you could say, to hell, to being completely trapped in the cycle of repeated birth, death, old age, and disease. And so that's affected most powerfully by our engaging in the chanting of Krishna's holy names, especially the Maha Mantra. That's the core of our spiritual practice. We have our regular practitioners, we have our time for japa meditation, but we also meditate together as a group in kirtan. And this actually cleanses our heart. This actually cleanses our hearts of those selfish perspectives based on the idea that there isn't anything other than matter. That we are all consciousness, and as such, we are at least family. There are senses in which we're identical. We all experience suffering and pleasure the same. We have different pleasures and different things bother us, but our experience of these things are the same. Even Chanakya Pandit says that in his Niti Shastra. He says that a wise person sees other people's suffering as the same as ours, other people's suffering and enjoyment. Atmavat sarva bhuteshu yapashati sapandita. That if we see others' suffering and enjoyment as just being the same as ours, that's the perspective of a wise person. So Srila Prabhupada gives us that perspective in the Bhagavatam right from the get-go. When you started the first canto, did you read that preface?
No, Maharaj. I'll now go back and read, actually.
Oh, please do. And especially those first two paragraphs. I sometimes use those as the basis for a Sunday lecture or something. So powerful, such a broad, liberal vision, liberal in the best sense, not in any political sense, but very, very broad-minded. Srila Prabhupada told us Brahmana means broad-minded, Brahmana means liberal, and liberal in the sense of broad-minded. And the antonym to Brahmana is Kripana. The Kripana has a very narrow vision. It's all about me. It's like in the 11th canto of the Bhagavatam, we see that one Brahmana of Avantipur who was so miserly that he wouldn't even spend money on his own sense gratification. So eventually everybody detested him, and he lost all his wealth, and ended up accepting sannyas. Yes, Sudhir mentioned that we tend to skip front matter, but I try whenever I have an opportunity to call folks' attention to that preface to Srimad Bhagavatam. So so amazing. Is there anything else?
Thank you,
I
Maharaj.
have a question.
Please.
And you may have already answered it because that was a very eloquent explanation on lust and desires and envy. But I keep coming back to the word fear and the fearlessness.
Mm.
Where does fear play into the lust, the desires? Are they connected? Is fear something completely separate? How does fear keep us entangled in this material nature, especially since, you know, we're in the age of Kali and it's categorized by high anxiety and quarrel and hypocrisy?
There is high anxiety. It reminds me of a wonderful movie, Mel Brooks movie. It was a satire of spy movies that were very popular, I think, in the 50s and 60s, especially Bond films and other spy films. High anxiety. Of course, there's fear of death. We know that when we die, we lose everything that we have. Anyone who's honest, who's at all honest, at least knows that, whether they'll acknowledge it or not. Advertising is based largely on fear. Because I'm a writer, I remember many years ago, my sister thought, well, maybe I could have a side gig writing advertising copy. And she sent me a book that she had heard was highly regarded, the book about writing ad copy. And I found the book appalling because the main point the book made was that advertising is based on fear. So I fear I won't get the girl at the end of the story, right? Or I fear I won't win the prize. Sometimes fear paralyzes us. When I was young, I was a really good singer, but I could not sing a solo just because I guess, very, very shy, and shyness is about being judged, the feeling that the conviction that we're always being judged. People are always judging us. And I could not sing a solo, even though I wanted to, because I knew that, well, if all the girls could hear my voice alone, of course they would all know how cool I was and they would want to hang out with me. But I simply couldn't do it. I was great in an ensemble. I was great in a choir. But I could never sing a solo as much as I wanted to. I would get sick at the thought. So, fear is always there. In one of his Sandarbhas, can't remember which one now, Jiva Goswami explains what the contrast between the spiritual realm of existence and the material realm. And the spiritual realm is called Tripada Vibhuti. And sometimes, quite often, pretty consistently, actually, Srila Prabhupada presents it as suggesting that most souls live in the spiritual world and a small minority of souls live in the material world. But Jiva Goswami also explains it a different way. And that is that there are three features of the spiritual realm, which are eternity, love, and something else. Gosh, there I am with lists again. And the material world is characterized by one thing: mortality.
Mm.
So that that is the sum and substance of our life in the material world. Krishna sums it up in the Gita with 2 words, dukkhalayam ashashvatam. There's always going to be some kind of suffering, some degree of suffering. It doesn't have to mean, you live in the Sudan, which is being destroyed by civil war, or you live in, Ukraine, which has been destroyed by the Russian invasion over the last 3 years, or anything like that. It can mean someone steals your parking spot. That's inconvenience. Or the older lady in front of you in line at the checkout counter at the store who's paying for her purchase with coins from one of those little plastic coin purses. And that's usually when I'll look at the people behind me in line and apologize, because I'll just say, well, this happens to me a lot when I try to check out of a store. Somebody in front of me their credit card gets rejected, or it's the little old lady who I now realize is probably considerably younger than I am, counting out, paying for her purchase by counting out quarters and nickels and dimes from a little plastic coin purse. So that's our experience. And so we're either afraid, one of the big fears that we've had attention called to over the last few years is fear of missing out. And that's a big thing in advertising. Or there was, I think one good, I don't know if I haven't seen TV in a long time, so I don't know exactly what ads are on television, but when I was young, they had ads for a deodorant soap called Dial. And they would have they'd have a guy on the subway. And so you got somebody holding on to the loop or the bar or whatever, and somebody who's shorter and their face is kind of like pushed into that guy's underarm. And the headline of the ad was, "Aren't you glad you use Dial? Don't you wish everyone did?" So there's fear everywhere in this world. Fear of death, fear of missing out, fear of losing what we have. And so it's really, I think, inseparable from material existence. If mortality is the one feature of the material world, then the fear that accompanies that mortality is also all pervasive. Is that okay?
That was perfect. Thank you, Maharaj.
Thank you. It's a good question. I think we just got to start on an answer. Oh gosh, we have a couple more minutes. Is there anything else?
I also had one question, Maharaj, if I may go.
Yes, please.
First of all, Hare Krishna, Maharaj, very blessed
Krishna.
to hear you tonight. So it's a very common verse, and I have heard everybody's version, but I really wanted to know your insight on that. So we have heard about karmanyevadikaraste ma phalesu kadachana, right? So I struggle with the fact that I feel, and this is my understanding, that, just do your karma and leave everything, the result and the outcome to Krishna. But I have also heard since childhood that God only helps those who help themselves. So for me, it's very hard to, understand that when should you really stop taking control of things in your life and just kind of give up, or not give up, but basically just trust God's plan. And like, I struggle a lot with that when should I just let go? Because I'm somebody who is like really trying hard for everything, because I feel like I should just, do my karma. But at what point I should just stop and give up and just leave everything to God's plan?
That's a big question, and the answer is even bigger, and we just ran out of time. But essentially, Krishna is exhorting Arjuna to do his duty as assiduously as he can, to apply himself to his duty as a warrior. And not only that, Krishna is there to help him, because he's serving Arjuna as his chariot driver. And the chariot driver wasn't just a chauffeur, but the chariot driver also understands the battlefield, knows all the warriors, their strengths and weaknesses, and as well as the weaknesses of the warrior whose chariot he's piloting. So he's like a golf caddy, which is why that fellow was able to come to take the perspectives of the Gita, at least according to his understanding, and set them on a golf course in that book. I haven't read the book or seen the movie, Legend of Bagger Vance, because the charioteer, just like the golf caddy knows the golfer, knows the course, knows the golfer's tools, and is able to give advice on how to play each hole. So Krishna was there to personally help Arjuna navigate doing his duty. But at the end, he told him, forget all of it and just depend utterly on me. And that comes as our faith in Krishna grows. And that still doesn't mean we're not going to do our best. We see what an endeavor Srila Prabhupada made to introduce Krishna consciousness to the rest of the world. He was an older man on the verge of 70 when he got on a freighter and came to the United States with, no money, no fixed place to stay. And what was his plan? Sometimes I used to hear devotees talk about Srila Prabhupada having some big plan already laid out. But his plan is expressed in those two poems he wrote on the Jaladuta, that prayer to the lotus feet of Krishna that he wrote in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and Markine Bhagavad Dharma, preaching Bhagavad Dharma in America, that he wrote on his arrival at Boston Harbor. And that was to let Krishna do it for him. He made the plea in both. I have no qualification. I don't have any knowledge. I don't have any devotion. I don't know what I'm doing. But in the prayer to the lotus feet of Krishna, he says, but you're the cleverest of all. You're the wisest of all. But you can make this happen. My spiritual master's given me this impossible order. But if you make this happen, just think how pleasing it will be to all the Vaishnavas to see people everywhere taking up the holy names of Hare Krishna, Hare Rama. And so the extent to which we're able to let go depends largely on the extent to which we have that faith in Krishna. The Bhagavatam tells us twice that it's a virtue to know our actual qualification, to actually understand where we are and to behave accordingly, and then it's a fault to do otherwise. So if we artificially, that's the word I'm looking for, if we artificially try to leave everything up for Krishna, even though we don't really have that confidence in him yet, we may find ourselves in a really tough spot sometime along the way. So we try to stretch, we try, if we it's just like with learning a musical instrument or science, a scientific discipline, or an athletic skill, building strength or whatever. We always push just a little beyond what's comfortable, not too much, because we can get hurt, right? If we, if I were to try to do a deadlift of 230 pounds, the first thing that would happen is that I would never be able to use my shoulders again. I would completely destroy them just trying. Not only that, but I wouldn't even get it off the ground. you know, like that old Sita Swayamvar film where, you know, everybody tried to lift Lord Shiva's bow and they all ended up falling on their okole, on their, you know, on their bottoms instead. And even Ravana, who thought he had it together, you know, he breaks into a sweat, starts chanting Shiva's name, looking for some kind of help. But, you know, if we actually have that complete faith in Ram, then, you know, we saw how easy, you know, if you've seen that film or read the Ramayana, we know how easy it was for Ram to pick the bow up and not just string it, but actually break it. So it's a big question. And it really depends, you know, it's good for us to be introspective enough to kind of understand our own actual situation, spiritual situation. And we can do that best by finding good company with people who can help us clarify that. So therefore, we keep this kind of company.
Yeah, definitely gave me some clarity.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Sika, and Sujanya as well. Okay, we have run out of time. It's time to move on to the next class. As we would have. I know I have to let you go because well, for you all, it's after 9 o'clock and that's late.
After 10 o'clock for many on the East
Oh
Coast
my
here.
goodness.
So
Yes, I hadn't considered that you weren't all Chicago people.
yeah. Actually, most are not Chicago people.
Oh, okay.
But thank you so
All right.
much, Maharaj, for being with us today. If everyone, you want to maybe do some reactions or whatever you'd like to do to thank Maharaj for being with us, that'd be wonderful.
Cool.
Hare Krishna. Your company
Thank you
is my
so much.
reward.
Thank you so much.
We hope to have you back again sometime soon. And
I would love it. I would be delighted.
yeah. And if you'd be willing, if you'd be willing to answer questions offline, I'd be happy to share your contact information or email
Please
address,
do.
whatever you like.
Please
Yeah.
do. Yeah,
Okay.
feel free to do so.
Yeah.
I look forward
Wonderful.
to it.
I just
Thank you
want
so much, Maharaj. Yeah.
Maharaj.
appreciation, Maharaj. Our 11-year-old had been hearing your class, and he just commented that Maharaj explains things by relating them to like football and TV shows and movies. So like I can understand. This is like so relatable, he's saying.
To
Thank
see
you.
how much I'm in Maya.
No, Govinda.
You know how to deal with people who are in Maya, so thank you.
From a lot of experience dealing with my own mind.
Well, thank you so much, Maharaj. I think
Which
this
is
was
why I'm
wonderful.
taking all those Karuna Care courses, some of them over again. Thank you all so much. Hare Krishna.
Thank you.
And-
Hare
Krishna.
Krishna.
Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Jai.
Hare
Jai.
Krishna, everyone. Take care.
Hello.
Hare